I was under the impression a lot of it was going to come back to just the Silk Road, but you went so far beyond that.
Definitely. I mean, the Silk Road was the beginning of the story, but truly, it is a decade-long story that starts with the Silk Road and ends, in a place that is, with about dark web sites that are 10 times the size of the Silk Road, among other things. Yeah.
Yeah, and for people out there who just aren't familiar, can you briefly just explain what the Silk Road was, and then we'll get into it for sure. But
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Silk Road, and tell me if we should break this down even further. The Silk Road was a dark web drug website, where a dark web drug market where you could essentially log on with this anonymity software called Tor, the Tor browser. Silk Road itself ran as a website that used Tor to make it impossible for anybody to figure out where it was hosted and who ran it. And it was essentially like this dark web eBay for all sorts of contraband, but mainly drugs. It was essentially like an online bazaar, like a market for every drug imaginable, that grew into, by 2013, a massive operation where like hundreds of millions of dollars in drugs were being transacted all the time.
yeah, and when you think about it, it was a huge part of the story was the fact that you had to use Bitcoin to do the actual transactions, and this was the earliest days of cryptocurrency period, but Bitcoin as well, because 2011 Bitcoin came out in 2009, so it was much cheaper and far less known, and this website in a lot of ways people say legitimized it.
Totally. I mean, should I talk about like how I like started
Absolutely.
getting into
Let's get to the start of it. Yep.
I first, well, I guess around this time you're referencing, like 2010, 2011, I was working on a book that we talked about last time, that was really, like, partially at least, about the cypherpunk movement, this social movement, very interesting group of mostly dudes, I should say, who I was going to say guys, but it is mostly men who believed that they could use encryption. And this started, I'm really talking about like a group that began in the 1990s. They believed that they could use encryption technologies, like secrecy tools, like the ability to encrypt information so that even the government couldn't crack it, to take power away from like federal governments and corporations and give it to individuals.
So mostly like radical libertarian types.
Exactly, yeah. And definitely this group like gave rise to what we now use as like VPNs and Tor, which I just talked about, and also WikiLeaks is like and the whole idea of granting anonymity, but actually guaranteeing it for journalistic sources and leakers using these tools that Julian Assange came up with. He was a cypherpunk too. That came out of the cypherpunk movement. And so as I was like kind of getting like really obsessed with this group for a different book that I was writing, I came upon what seemed to be this new cypherpunk invention. It was described to me that way. Bitcoin. This guy, Gavin Andresen, who was one of the first Bitcoin developers, programmers, gave this kind of TED-style talk that I watched on YouTube at the time, where he described Bitcoin as basically like cypherpunk money, like a kind of digital cash for the internet that, among other things, like could be sent anonymously to anyone in the world. That it's appeared to be this kind of cypherpunk holy grail thing that this movement have been trying to achieve for a long time without success, which is like essentially anonymous crypto money. I mean, the word cryptocurrency was like not in common use then. So when I wrote the first piece, I actually interviewed Gavin Andresen. I tracked him down. I wrote this piece for Forbes magazine about Bitcoin, which I think was like the first print magazine piece about Bitcoin.
Like 2011-ish?
In April of 2011.
Okay.
And I actually headlined that piece cryptocurrency, like thinking I'd come up with this clever pun, but like nobody was using that phrase back then. And Gavin had described Bitcoin to me as untraceable, and I believed it was. And even Satoshi Nakamoto, this mysterious creator of Bitcoin, nobody, of course, still knows who he or she or they are.
Could be multiple people.
Had themselves or himself or whatever described Bitcoin in this email, introducing it to a cryptography mailing list and saying, like, among its features that participants can be anonymous. So it really did seem like even the creator of Bitcoin thought this was going to be like a kind of anonymous cash, like you could for the digital world, like you could put you know unmarked bills in a briefcase and like send it across the world to anybody without revealing your identity at all, without any identifying information associated with it whatsoever. And that seemed to me to be like, I mean, I unfortunately was not interested in investing in Bitcoin at the time. In April of 2011, a Bitcoin was worth $1. And I thought like, as I write this magazine piece, maybe I should just buy like $40 worth of Bitcoins, like 40 Bitcoins. And unfortunately, like I tried this on the only existing cryptocurrency exchange at the time, Mt. Gox, which was very buggy.
We'll talk about that for sure.
and it didn't work. I couldn't get the transaction to go through, and I gave up, which was like I don't like to think too much about how much that mistake cost me. But
Yikes!
What I'm trying to, it was a multi-million dollar little.
I got
snafu.
sick reading that for you.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah, but then I wasn't interested in like this notion of Bitcoin as a lot of people see it today as like kind of digital gold, like a way to store your money as an investment. I was interested in, I think a lot of people were back then, in the notion that Bitcoin was kind of like this almost subversive sort of digital cash that like could be spent without a trace, just like cash can be in a drug deal or whatever. And sure enough, like as you were saying, I mean, just months later, the Silk Road kind of appeared online. I think it actually may have launched in 2010, but nobody really was aware of it until 2011. And I like came upon this like dark web market that seemed to be offering like all sorts of illegal drugs for sale in Bitcoin. And it kind of confirmed this idea to me that like, yeah, Bitcoin truly is a crypto cash for the internet, and it evades any attempt at regulation or tracing or law enforcement. And that's certainly like how the creator of this Silk Road saw it. This another mysterious at the time figure who called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts. To be fair, like I should say that when I first saw the Silk Road online, I was like, this can't be real. This must be a scam. Like this like there's heroin listed for sale here. Like this is either like I don't know, like just some sort of pipe dream. Like this is not going to really work, or it's truly a scam. Like somebody's trying to steal people's Bitcoins, of which there have been a million scams like that.
Still are, yeah.
Yeah. And it was only like a few months later after that Adrian Chen at Gawker wrote the real like first real piece about the Silk Road. And he had found people who had bought like acid off the Silk Road, and it worked perfectly well. And kind of I couldn't believe that I'd missed, like, being so obsessed with the cypherpunks, I'd like missed an even bigger story than Bitcoin, it seemed at the time. Like an actual black market on the dark web, transacting in cryptocurrency and selling every drug imaginable, and it was real. I mean, that was another regret. But
you tested it out though.
Well, sure. I mean, certainly, like at that point, I was like fully like, I was in fact trying to figure out like how can I get the next big story about the Silk Road. As it grew into like a massive phenomenon, and as that when the Gawker piece came out that Adrian wrote, Chuck Schumer and I forget Joe Manchin, I think, like held a press conference even to say like, this is we condemn this horrible website that represents like a new chapter in the war on drugs and is powered by untraceable cryptocurrency. It was a massive controversy immediately, and they called on the DEA to shut this site down.
Yeah, and that was towards the beginning. But obviously Bitcoin was worth a lot less, but in the first year there, they were already doing tens of millions of dollars of revenue on that. No,
absolutely. I mean, the thing about like the exchange rate of Bitcoin goes up, goes down, but the actual sort of economy of buying and selling things in Bitcoins like the drugs didn't change in value. So like anybody who was buying heroin on the Silk Road or acid or whatever in 2011, that was turned out to be very expensive acid for them because if you spent like whatever, when Bitcoin was worth $1 and you were buying whatever $50 worth of weed or something, that turned out to be like millions of dollars worth in future money. But nobody could have known that at the time, and it really was working, and absolutely not immediately, but very soon, like the Silk Road was doing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of transactions a day.
Now, how would it work? Because you have a dark web market, so it's not like you have a government backstop regulator here. This is all obviously completely under the table. They have to access it on Tor, as you said, and use Bitcoin to transact. But if I went on there, as you did, and it might be helpful to talk about like your experience when you did buy some stuff on behalf of Forbes and everything, but
certainly,
like
only on behalf of Forbes,
only on behalf of Forbes,
just as an experiment.
Did not use any of the drugs. Let's be clear about that. But still, when you would make the purchase, my understanding is that the money wouldn't go straight away to the seller. They'd put it in like an escrow thing so that the transaction would have to be confirmed on your end. Like you had to receive it and then tell the site like, "Ooh, I got it." Now they can give the money over.
Yeah, I mean the Silk Road was really a brilliant invention. I mean, people like look back on it and see flaws in it, but the Dread Pirate Roberts who ran this thing really did come up with some serious innovations.
Yeah.
Just there were almost like financial innovation, even more than like technological. So there was an escrow where when you buy drugs, your money is put into escrow and then it's only released once you receive the drugs in the mail. Something that nobody really would have. I would have never thought that was possible to ship drugs in the mail in these quantities, and that it would not all be caught. But it worked, and it was.
Yeah.
And the dealers, like the vendors, who were third parties, like the Dread Pirate Roberts is sitting in the middle as this administrator of the market. He's the market maker, but then like the buyers and sellers are acting independently, and these dealers started to like really come up with clever ways to hide the drugs in shipping it, and there was an entire user forum where people discussed like the best ways to like obfuscate the drugs that you were sending in the mail.
Yeah, there were a lot of good ways to do that. I remember college. That was some wild shit people would do.
Yeah, and like the clever things like you're sending like psychedelic mushrooms in the mail, and you put it inside of a fake beef stroganoff package that looks like the dried mushrooms on the side of that, whatever. I mean, there were just an endless number of these things, but then also just like triple sealing it in Mylar and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that all worked incredibly well. But then, so then once you receive the drugs in the mail, you confirm that you got it. That only then is the money in the escrow released to the seller, so they can't scam you. Then there's like ratings and reviews, which in the drug world is actually like really important. You can, the quality of these drugs can be assessed in a way that was never possible with, just like buying random drugs from some dude in the bathroom of a club or something. It was a real innovation, and not like I would never claim that it was absolutely a criminal operation, but it was also it's really important to get this across that like the Dread Pirate Roberts was a political figure.
Yes,
he saw the Silk Road as a political experiment first, at least. Like that was his first conception of it. I do believe that. Like he was this radical libertarian. He wanted with the Silk Road to just show that it was going to be possible in this new era of this kind of cypherpunk utopia that he foresaw, to just like buy and sell things without any participation from the government, no taxation, no restrictions. Anybody can buy and sell anything and put into their bodies whatever they choose to, So he really, I think, wanted to take the violence out of the drug trade, among other things.
Yeah, he was he thought the war on drugs was a total disaster and that this was the one-stop shop to fix it. And I think when you look through the catalogs now of all his online correspondence behind the names, it's pretty clear that, to me, and we're talking about DPR, who ended up being Ross Ulbricht. We'll talk about how that went down and everything. But Ross was a guy who, I think, from behind the keyboard, started to feel the power of the movement itself and let that affect his actions, because he wasn't a guy. This was not a guy out there buying Lamborghinis or anything like that. He lived a very simple life. He wasn't this like just doing it for his own fame type guy, but the movement, the political ideology of radical libertarianism in this case, really overtook him and drove an incredible innovation, but also led him to slip up and get caught.
I would say, I mean, I feel bad saying this because just to set the context here, Ross Ulbricht is like serving life in prison now, and
no parole.
Without parole, 2 life sentences, I think, and he is in a vulnerable position. He can't truly like speak for himself, but I do think so I feel bad like saying critical things about him, but just you have to tell this story properly. I think that he was eventually, we'll get to this, I guess, kind of corrupted in his ideals. And I think eventually he was not just doing stuff out of libertarian and idealistic motivation. He had become sort of enamored of the power and the millions of dollars flowing like through, around his invention, and did some, nasty things to try to protect that. But it definitely, there's no question that it started from a place of idealism, and he had rules for the Silk Road that you could only buy and sell things that he considered to be victimless crimes. There was no child pornography, what we now call like child sexual abuse materials. There was no murder for hire, although that's a story that the media has told endlessly. The Silk Road did not have like assassination services for sale. There were at some points weapons for sale. I mean, the Dread Pirate Roberts believed, I think, that like, guns can be used for self-defense, but there were limits in that he like disallowed any weapon that could be used on like large groups of people, for instance. Like he didn't, I think, want obviously to become like a hub for terrorism. And eventually he shut down even the gun sales because it wasn't really working very well. I think it's a lot harder to send a gun through the mail.
Yeah, I could imagine. I feel like that one they can find through metal detectors pretty easy.
Right. But there were, this notion of like victimless crime was real on the Silk Road. There were hacking tools that were sold eventually, but the rules were that those are not supposed to be sold. And eventually the government pointed to those as examples of like, exceptions to this victimless crime rule. And I don't really know how that happened. I think that in part the site just grew so big that, or I don't know. I mean, even that is like selling hacking tools was a very small part of the Silk Road's business. And for a very long time, like even the drug sales, it's important to point out, most of it was not like heroin,
right?
Was not cocaine even. It was like
mushrooms, acid.
A lot of ecstasy.
Yeah,
ecstasy was like a major product on there, in part because the quality of it could be guaranteed, which is always like, I think been a challenge with MDMA. So there was like when you looked at the Silk Road in 2011, 2012, it really did seem like a super interesting and ethically complicated place, not just not a drug cartel or a criminal operation, in a simple way like that.
Definitely violating all international law for sure,
and people bought heroin and died from the Silk Road. There's no doubt that it expanded the drug trade probably in ways that there were stories of people who had gone clean, but then moved someplace where like drugs were not very accessible. But then when they saw the Silk Road, they couldn't resist the temptation.
Yeah,
and drugs are morally complicated.
Yes, they are.
But I just always want to tell the story of the Silk Road in this way that doesn't just make it sound like Ross Ulbricht, like the Dread Pirate Roberts, was Scarface or something.
Yeah. So my stance on this, and you and I have talked about this before a little bit off air, and I've talked about it on some other podcasts back in the day, earlier on when we were doing these. I think there were 2 podcasts in particular where it got covered a bunch. But when people were talking about like the pardon with Ross, because his sentence was insane, what he was given. His crime did not fit the sentence at all. But when people are talking about pardon, I've always backed off that and said, listen, I don't think the guy's necessarily a bad guy. And I think there's a lot of amazing innovation he had, but you can't violate every international law on drugs and some other things and not be punished for that. But I've always therefore looked at like commutation as a route with his sentence, which we'll see what happens there. But, you know, I think the world can get really complicated, and you can see people innovate ahead of where governments are, and perhaps then, not perhaps in this case, 100% inject their political ideology into it in a way that's radical. Let's call it what it is. But I also think that the way that they painted him out to be was far beyond the scope of what he was. For one thing, I feel pretty confident based on the evidence that he was in over his head pretty quickly, and that it's very, very, to me, I fully believe, but I think from an evidence perspective, it is very easy to make the case, at least I'll say, that there were multiple Dread Pirate Roberts, multiple people using that account. And so there's no doubt that some of the correspondence that happened on that account from behind the keyboard online was questionable, to say the least, and morally awful in some cases, as it got to with calling hits on people and things like that. But I think things do change when you're doing things online. It doesn't make anything right, but to me, just looking at it from a humanity perspective, I mean, we see people on Twitter, right? People on Twitter will say things that you can meet these people in person and then they're like kind of nice, or like they're not like that, or they'd never say it like that. And it's just this thing where you feel real confident behind a keyboard being able to say, do this, or I think this, or I think that. And there's definitely a part of me that thinks a lot of that happened with Ross and even some of the other guys who were operating behind that keyboard there, to where if some of the other guys were putting hits on people or whatever, and some people have accused Ross of that, he's denied that a lot, and the government did not bring those charges at trial. But, you know, if that were the case, I don't view it as the same capability of someone who's sitting here in a room and says, go hit that guy. You know what I mean? There's more of an emotional disconnection, and that's also their fault for setting up a system to where that is possible to happen.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Like I don't know where to begin with this. Like like I said, I think Ross was very idealistic. But he was, it's like, and you know, to your point that he was ahead of his time, I think it's, you know, so many kinds of drugs have been legalized or are about to be legalized that were for sale on the Silk Road. But it's also worth pointing out that Ross wasn't for drug legalization. He didn't want he didn't want drugs to be legalized and taxed, or the Dread Pirate Roberts didn't anyway. I should say, can I just, if I could just tell the story a little bit.
Yeah, please.
I got really,
you found yourself into the middle of it.
Right. I mean, I got really obsessed with the Dread Pirate Roberts. Even beyond the Silk Road, his creation, I wanted to do a piece on this person, the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was this political figure, saw himself as like leading a revolution in the way he was talking to his community on the Silk Road, which had its own user forums. He had a Dread Pirate Roberts book club where he was like, you know, recommending like anarcho-capitalist philosophy stuff. I mean, so I did like bug him for about 8 months until he agreed to an interview, and that's where he laid out a lot of this political ideology. When
was this?
That was in. I talked to him on July 4th of 2013. Yeah, for like, I don't know, a long time. It was all like done over the Silk Road's Tor protected messaging system. He like
all text.
He made me like a temporary drug dealer on the site, essentially, just to be able to have an account to like message with him directly.
How long did it take you to convince him to do that? Because you're doing it all via text, obviously.
Yeah.
It's not like you're seeing who he is, but how long did that take?
It took 8 months. Like I started asking in 2012, I think, and then he didn't, I think, want that kind of visibility or heat. And then I think
what was your pitch to him? I'm curious, because you find your way to get, like, you can see it in your books, too, with some of the people you get access to, but then look at your career of some of the publicity between Ross and before that, Julian Assange, before anyone who knew who Julian Assange was. Like, you find your way into these situations, and people give you the trust to be like, yeah, fuck yeah, come in, Andy.
Well, I do think that part of it is that Ross's ego was, or the Dread Pirate Roberts, whatever, his ego was growing over time as the Silk Road became bigger and bigger. And as law enforcement continued to chase them totally in vain. Like, I think that Ross's hubris, as it became like 1, then 2, and then 2.5 years ultimately, that he was evading law enforcement successfully. He thought that he was untouchable, and what he was doing was so remarkable that I think he started to want attention. But this is not actually even in the book, but I did do a thing with him eventually where I was like, okay, my editors say now that we're going to do this piece one way or another. If it's not going to be about you, I'm going to do it about your competitor site. Because at that point, there were these sort of copycat dark web markets, and they were part of the story too. I wasn't like lying to him. But I think at that point, he was like, well, I can't abide by one of these other dark web administrators getting the credit instead of me. So that's when he actually agreed to do it. And I don't know, that feels a little, maybe that's manipulative, but it was true also that like at some point this other site, Atlantis, was had popped up, was like gaining some of his market share, a little bit at least, and the administrators of that site had like their own chief marketing officer and stuff. So they were like ready to talk anytime. And if he didn't, if he wasn't going to talk, somebody else was going to. So,
and how long did you talk with him on there?
Well, I talked with him, like I said, for months off the record, and then then
on the
we
record,
spent like 5 hours
Wow.
going back and forth. But that's like in part because Tor is really slow, and also because I think in retrospect that he probably was talking to me while conferring with other people who helped him run the site, and including possibly, I think we differ in our opinions of like to what degree there were multiple Dread Pirate Roberts, but there was definitely this kind of second in command guy.
Yeah, what was his name again?
He goes by Variety Jones.
Yes, that's it. Variety Jones.
I think his real name turned out to be Roger Clark, I believe. I haven't covered his case so closely, but
he was like he was in Thailand or something. Was that it?
Yeah. Thailand comes up again later, but he I think was not only kind of advising Ross, but also like pushing him to become more of like a hardcore criminal. I've seen ultimately the chats between them, the IMs. I don't think that they knew each other's real identities, by the way. Like so many people on the dark web, they work together only through text, through Tor, never actually met in person.
Didn't Ross know the identity? I could be remembering this wrong from Nick Bilton's book, but I feel like Ross, there was a thing where he made anyone who was going to join on send them a copy of their driver's license or something.
It's a really interesting question. Like, he definitely did that for most of the people who worked for him. But now that I think about it, I don't think he did that for Roger Clark.
Might be true.
For Variety Jones.
I can't remember.
It was this incredible thing that like he made the people who worked for him send them their identifying information, and he kept it on his encrypted laptop. Thinking this was like he had full disk encryption on his laptop, so he thought if I just close the lid, law enforcement will never be able to access this.
That's the problem.
And like that, but just the fact that it took so long to catch Variety Jones, the second in command guy, whereas the other people on the site were quite easily identified because their IDs were on his laptop. But we'll get to like how that laptop was accessed. Yeah. But like, I think that probably Variety Jones was just more careful. And he also had like a sort of power over Ross. I mean, you could see in their conversations when they eventually came out in legal documents, that like he was really influencing Ross in a kind of insidious way. And I've read the conversation where Ross thinks that he's got an employee who has stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoins from him, and he doesn't know what to do. And Variety Jones, his second in command guy, Lothario kind of figure, is like, I think this guy needs to get killed.
That was Curtis Green, right?
That's right. And
the employee. And
Ross, you can see him like hesitating, not wanting to do this. I mean, the whole notion of the Silk Road is that it's going to be a non-violent, that it actually reduces violence in the drug trade. But he like you can see him be talked into it by Variety Jones. And I think you and I like maybe disagree about this. I do believe that Ross himself who I believe was at the very least, most of the time, he was the Dread Pirate Roberts, that he was persuaded to try to have people killed.
Now, I'm not going to put the picture of Curtis Green in the corner because I don't want to get the video demonetized, but people can Google that. Silk Road, Curtis Green, fake murder. There's a picture that it will look like a dead body, but he is very much alive. There were federal agents who staged the image itself. I forget what they use, like soup packets or some shit.
Exactly. They used like Campbell's soup, like to make it look like he had sort of vomited like during this torture session.
Exactly.
I mean, it's all really grisly stuff, but all fake. Like
all fake.
The DEA. This is like a bizarre story that I don't tell this story in like incredible detail in the book. This book is just tells the Silk Road story as a preamble to what was to come.
Yes.
But like it is an amazing story of like they essentially identified Curtis Green, set him up to be this victim of a fake murder.
The task force did.
And this is, by the way, like one task force in Baltimore that was going after the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Are you talking about, just to be clear, are you talking about just the DEA part of it right now with Baltimore?
It was just Baltimore. It was actually like multiple agencies.
Because I was going to say, it was
Homeland Security,
yeah.
DEA, Secret Service.
FBI,
they were all involved.
IRS.
I'm not sure about FBI or IRS in Baltimore.
Right. And okay, that's what I'm
There was
asking.
another
Got
team
it.
simultaneously tracking DPR, chasing Ulbricht, eventually identifying him, based out of New York.
That was Chris Tarbell and
That's
the FBI.
that's the FBI, IRS,
Yeah.
IRS criminal investigations, and they had their own Homeland Security guy. So it's a very complicated. But there were actually two competing teams going after him.
Was that I'm going to fuck up his name, but Van Dergeman or something? Was he the New York one? And then there was other Homeland Security people working with Baltimore?
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, Jared Duryagian is the guy's name, and he was based out of Chicago, just to complicate things further. But he was working with the New York team,
right? Okay.
And they were, just to simplify it, like they were the more by the book, successful, and I would say like kind of like, not to be too insulting to like all the people involved in Baltimore, but the more top tier, like Southern District of New York, where that case was prosecuted out of, where it was led, is always like the one that's doing the big internet cases.
I want to bookmark that though, because I do want to come back to how they access Frosty. That's interesting. But the server.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to get you off Curtis Green though. There's so much here. We'll
there's this Baltimore team that was doing much, I don't know, weirder stuff, including faking this murder. But I don't think so. There was never a real murder that Ross actually paid for, or but I do actually believe that he thought that he had someone murdered.
It's a perfectly reasonable opinion to have, and you and I have talked about this before, like I said, off air, and so I respect that, because also, as people have already heard, you were at the middle of this thing while it was going down. You were then a main feature in the documentary Deep Web in 2015, which discussed a lot of this case right when it was finishing up trial. But with Curtis Green, couple things that I would throw out there just as like maybe, but I don't know. First of all, I have always wondered, and I don't even know how technologically possible this is, but you never know with government organizations and what they have access to. I have always wondered if there was any correspondence or data edited after the fact. That has been a curious thing to me. And secondly, I find it very suspect that Curtis Green himself, the actual guy, Curtis Green, who today is, he made a deal to do that whole thing, and I don't even think did time, or if he did, very short time, but he's regular citizen doing his thing now. He goes around with Ross Ulbricht's mother, Lynn, and does podcasts and openly discusses how
he fully disagree. He fully agrees, rather, with you. He says there were multiple Dread Pirates. I don't know what to make of that. I can say, maybe we have to the chat logs. Like, some of them were from the Silk Road server. Some of them were for Ross Ulbricht's laptop. Mm-hmm. Could those have been altered?
I don't know. I say that totally.
And it seems unlikely, but possible, I guess. But the thing is, and this is like what my book is about, is that at Ross Ulbricht's trial, they not only showed that they could trace the Bitcoins from the Silk Road server to Ross Ulbricht's laptop, but they showed money coming out of Ross Ulbricht's laptop that was exactly the amounts and the timing for the hits that he was commissioning. And this is not the Curtis Green murder for hire.
Yeah, there were like 5 or something under
another
question.
Collection of them that followed, sort of like going after a scammer who had scammed money from the Silk Road and his associates. And in that case, you can see it on the blockchain. And this is what my book is about.
Yes.
This is not like this is an interesting case because it's almost I after Ross Ulbricht was busted, and we haven't even talked about how that happened.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute.
I attended every minute of his trial in New York, and I was as shocked as anybody when one day of this trial they used Bitcoin tracing as part of the evidence against him. I mean, it had started to become clear at that point that Bitcoin was not the untraceable digital cash, anonymous, untraceable money that I had thought it was. That perhaps even people like the Cypherpunks and even Satoshi Nakamoto thought it was. But this was the first time it ever was used in a courtroom, and they could show on the blockchain. And I've looked at this myself. I mean, the blockchain. The amazing thing about it is that it's a public record of every Bitcoin transaction. If you know whose addresses are whose, you can look that up yourself. And I did this, and matching it with the what the prosecution has listed as Ross Ulbricht's Bitcoin addresses taken from his laptop, you can see yourself the transactions where he was paying what he thought was a hitman. So he actually thought it was like a Hell's Angels gang member who was going to do these murders for him.
How long was his trial, approximately?
It was very short. I mean, well, I don't know. I haven't covered that many trials, like gavel to gavel, as they say, but it was, I think, 3 weeks maybe.
Okay, so it wasn't like crazy long. But
no.
One thing that has always sat wrong with me, because again, you would think too, the basis of your book right here, which is that they can trace Bitcoin. We're going to talk a lot about that with these other cases as well today, because it's pretty nuts and people need to hear about this. But you would think that in the trial, when they're even presenting that as evidence, which I wasn't even, maybe I was aware at one point, but I didn't even remember that they did that, because when they announced the charges against Ross and catching him, and maybe we should talk about finally how that happened in a second, but in the media, they tried him by media. It was going to be a federal courtroom, so no cameras in there. They knew that. They said, oh, we're going to charge him with 6 hits and all this stuff and running this whole site and whatever. And then they get to the trial, and before the trial, they drop all the hits charges. They did not charge him with that, yet they still discussed it in the courtroom, and they quote-unquote provided the smoking gun evidence that he exchanged the proper Bitcoin to have ordered these hits. So why did they not charge him with the hits? That's what makes me go, there's a rat there.
Well, I don't know why they didn't charge him. I can say that they did charge him with murder for hire in another case in Maryland because of that Baltimore group that was doing that separately. They actually had a murder charge against him, which that case was then dropped once he was given a life sentence. So the question is, like, why did the Southern District of New York, in the case that actually went to trial, not include murder for hire? And what I've actually been told years later is that it was like a jurisdictional issue. But, I don't know why.
Never heard of that for Southern District in New York.
They could have, I'm sure, made a case somehow to include the
it's
murders.
Crazy.
I think that they would have to have shown that, like, the purported victims or the purported perpetrator was in the Southern District of New York. And they did have to do stuff like buy drugs undercover in the Southern District of New York to make that a New York case. There are, like, always these jurisdictional things that, are like kind of legal sausage making for prosecutors.
Yes.
But, is that why? I don't know. It's strange. And I think truly a problem that the jury in that room and I and everybody else hears the whole story of Ross's, attempted murders for hire, and that's not actually those are not the charges against
Right.
him, and then he is sentenced in part based on that.
Are you even? But this is where I'm really
but
not a
the-
lawyer. Are you allowed to do that if you don't charge someone with something? Are you allowed to present evidence? That might be a really dumb question, but
I would say the other thing, I'm sorry to get like really legalistic. The other thing is that there was a charge against Ross called continuing criminal enterprise. And that's, people call that the Kingpin statute. And what that like technically means is like that you have like at least 5 people working for you
Right.
in your criminal enterprise. And he certainly did, I think.
yes, absolutely.
I think his defense probably could have gone after that and said, "Look, prove that. Like prove that there were 5 people working for him," because I'm not sure that they could have proved that. But who knows?
Yeah, by the way, I always thought this was, he needed to get 8-10 years in prison. The
Yeah.
other guys in the case all got like 3 to 6. I mean, I always thought, to be clear, that like, yeah, you have to go to prison for this. This isn't like, oh, get probation or help it. It's like, yeah, there's certainly retribution that's needed. It's just a matter of he eventually was sentenced to double life without parole in Supermax. That's
Absolutely.
crazy.
But this charge, I've talked on and off the record to the Silk Road prosecutors in the years since, and
You talk to Preet.
no, these are like the people like Preet is like the
Preet
boss.
doesn't try it. He's the boss. Though.
Exactly.
He makes the shots.
The thing is that this continuing criminal enterprise, this Kingpin statute, as it's known colloquially, does sort of like the prosecutors say that the violence that he was accused of sort of can be included in the sentencing under this Kingpin statute. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how that works. I was there when he was convicted. I was there at his sentencing, and I listened to the judge in that case, lay out her argument for his sentence before she said what it was going to be. And it was extremely rational. It seemed like so well constructed, and like, I mean, she seems like a really intelligent, obviously person. And I was very impressed. And I was like, okay, these are really good points. Like,
Is Judge Forrest? Is that Forrester?
I hesitate to say her name because it's almost like, I don't want to like call for retribution against her. She's not a judge anymore.
It's not retribution. She just did her.
Sure. Her name is Catherine Forrest, right? Yeah. But then, and she made this argument that I thought was very smart, that like, yes, you say you took violence out of the drug trade, but actually you took it only out of one part of the drug trade. The wholesalers, essentially, who were, or the suppliers of drugs, the people in Afghanistan or Mexico or whatever, who then provide drugs to the people who sold on the Silk Road, that is physical, and the violence there exists as always. Those are probably the most violent, the most violence happens at the source.
Yes, absolutely.
And then she's saying this to Ross, you actually expanded the trade as a whole. Therefore, you expanded that violence, even as you perhaps took it out of the retail part of the drug trade. You expanded it in the rest of this supply chain. So, I was like, wow, that's actually quite interesting. She made a lot of good points like that I thought were quite smart. And she said also, like, you are making this argument that you're different from an average drug kingpin out of a place of privilege. Like, you are no different from whatever guy in the Bronx or whatever who is like handling the same flow of illegal narcotics. And like,
that's a fair point.
And I'm not going to the fact that you have a master's degree, that you were a Eagle Scout, that you're this nice kid from Texas, like, I'm not going to be swayed by that. And I thought that was all quite like interesting and seemed almost wise. And then she says, like, the conclusion of her argument, which is like, and therefore I sentence you to 2 life sentences in maximum security prison with no parole. And the whole room just like, there was like a deathly silence. I felt like I'd watched somebody be killed, like on the spot. It was so shocking. I just could not believe that was the result that she was building towards. And
how did he react?
I couldn't see his face. I could kind of like hear like gasps in the room. He was in front of me, facing the judge, and I think that is not a reasonable sentence. I think it was in its own way, a miscarriage of justice, and I don't know. I'm not sure that I believe that people deserve life sentences, maybe even ever.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like certainly not in this case, and probably not many other drug cases, even ones where people like purportedly whatever, even tried to have someone killed. Like it's
Life is life.
yeah,
It's a long time.
and as the years have passed since then, it's like it now feels like I now see. I knew immediately like this was wrong. I did not I hope that like you can see that I have like a very nuanced
Yes,
view of
yes,
Ross.
you
Like
do. I think you have a very fair view.
I think he had ideals. Those ideals were corrupted to some degree. I believe he tried to kill people. I don't believe he deserves to be like in a cage for the rest of his life, like decades and decades to come. And the
He's
more
been
time,
in there a decade now.
right, exactly, and
effectively.
like the more time that passes, like the longer that it becomes clear that that's how long life is, and the wronger it feels to me. But I also, when I say this, I feel like it's worth saying a lot of people in prison for life are there unjustly, and
Agreed.
just the fact that like I followed this case, that Ross is super interesting, doesn't like make him he doesn't deserve special treatment, but it is nonetheless like one example of a pretty unjust sentence.
Sometimes in these types of arguments, it kind of turns into everything else where you get the two loudest crowds, one being lock them up forever and throw away the key, and the other being, yeah, we really shouldn't punish people. We're over incarcerated and everything. And it's like, I recognize the punishment and retribution part of it, the nuance of that. And I recognize the nuance of we're way over incarcerated and, we have some archaic sentences and stuff. And like, I kind of try to live right here with things, as I do on a lot of things. And it's like, as I said on this case in particularly, yeah, he had to get punished for this. It's just, I don't think it's a stretch or ridiculous for people to say that, like other cases, as you point out, that we're not talking about right now, maybe people from less privilege as well, those sentences that sometimes are handed out that could be archaic like this are wrong. And it's very hard to break down a case, period, when you're looking at who was all affected. Drug trade affects thousands of people, millions of people, sometimes depending on how big you are. In this case, I'd say it was probably millions. And it's like, how do you put a time on that? How do you put also like the value of it being shut down already on that? How do you put a deterrent on that too? And one of the things in your
Absolutely.
book is that the deterrent didn't work too well.
Not at all. And that's another thing that I heard, Judge Forrest say in that room was like, basically like, I am punishing the hell out of you to make you an example of Ross Ulbricht, to prevent, as she put it, like somebody from walking in your misguided footsteps or picking up your flag or something like that. And so he was essentially being punished not only for himself, but for the crimes of like anybody who would follow him. And that did not work at all. Like, in fact, I wrote a story at one point about this study of the dark web drug trade. And of course, the dark web drug trade did not end with the Silk Road, but the dark web drug trade on the dates that Ross Ulbricht's sentence was handed down actually increased significantly, in part just because of the people were so shocked, and the news around this life sentence was enough to actually bring just more attention to something that people still didn't know that much about at the time. This was, I think, 2015 that he was sentenced, and
I believe so, yeah.
And more just put a spotlight on the people. I think just learned from that news. Oh, you can buy drugs on the dark web, and that trade actually just continued to explode. And the Silk Road being taken down, just as happens in the drug war, created a power vacuum that was just immediately filled, first by the Silk Road too, which was a kind of copycat site that was itself taken down, in part because, as you said, it was created by people who had worked on the first Silk Road, yes, and were therefore identified
Quite easily.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was because of how they caught Ross and everything. And that's a very interesting story. I'd love for you to recount, because you spoke with him, as you said, July 4th, 2013. I believe he was caught like 4 months later, right?
Just 3 months. Yeah, I think it was the end of October, I think.
Yeah, something like that. He was caught in San Francisco.
Yeah, and he was like, working on his laptop, the laptop, in a public library. He had like tried to work in a coffee shop and couldn't find an outlet for his like laptop, and he was running out of battery or something. So he went to the library next door in San Francisco and was like sitting there in the science fiction section of the library, working, like looking out the window in a public place, which I think he might have done in part so that even if somebody could defeat the protections of Tor and find his IP address, it might look still like it would be less identifiable because he was on some other network. I don't know. It ultimately was not a wise move, because what happened, just to like describe it play by play, I guess, like he hears these people having a fight behind him. It's like this man sort of like raises his fist to hit a woman behind him. He turns around, and at that moment, another undercover agent across the table from him, a woman, grabs his laptop while it's still open, yanks it like out of his reach. He realizes that like he's actually surrounded by undercover agents. He lunges for the laptop, but it's too late. Like another agent has got him in a bear hug, and his laptop is open, logged into the Silk Road. He's got like, if he had, as I think I said, his encryption on his laptop, so that if he had just managed to shut the lid, then it would have been encrypted. With encryption, modern encryption is strong enough that like the FBI or whoever potentially might not have been able to crack that within like human lifetimes.
Yeah.
Using the strongest computers they've got.
All he had to do was shut it.
So if he had just managed to shut the lid, he might have like prevented them from getting so much of the evidence that they used against them. He might have actually walked, like I think. But he didn't, and they got the laptop with everything. I mean, he had on this laptop a journal of creating the Silk Road, a logbook of like daily activities, all of his chats with all of the people working for him, and Variety Jones and everything. So, and a like a spreadsheet of his net worth, all of his assets and things. But as you said, like he, at the same time, he never spent most of the money that he was amassing, like the millions and millions of dollars in profits.
And Bitcoin.
He just sat on it and lived this almost ascetic life in San Francisco, like renting a room and like a house with other people. And, he when I interviewed him, even, he said to me, like, he spends almost none of his money, stays under the radar. And that was absolutely true. And I think that's because he was not, like, as I said, he's not Scarface. He was a guy with principles doing this for some reason, some motivation other than money.
Yeah. Yeah. And when they caught him, obviously they raided his place and everything. And so they found the flash drives that had the Bitcoin on it. And I can't remember now, but
a lot of it was on his laptop also.
It was on his laptop
Yeah.
too. Okay, so do they have that still today, or did they auction that off?
I think that all of the Silk Road coins were eventually auctioned. Yeah, I don't. In the years that followed. Yeah, we didn't really talk about like how he was found, though. I mean, we should.
Yeah. Let's do that.
So even though the Silk Road was online for 2.5 years, his Bitcoins were not traced to identify him. Like, it still seems as late as 2013, 2014. That Bitcoin could not be traced to like find someone. When even in his trial, when they followed the money from his server to his laptop, that seemed like cheating because you've already identified the computers at both ends, and they had identified his server, by the way, through what I think was a vulnerability likely a vulnerability in the Tor anonymity software.
That's what I wanted to ask you about.
Well,
I forget the details now, and I actually should have looked at that earlier. I didn't remember that before we went on camera, but there was even. obviously it wasn't you that wrote it, but there were a couple other articles. I believe one of them was in Wired when this all like came out, that did describe why like every hacker known to man, like a lot of the big names, I should say, went on record saying there is no possible way that Chris Tarbell and the cyber team at the FBI could have accessed this legally. They got this illegally. Well, it was in Iceland.
This was a very I don't know, probably kind of inside baseball for the like hacker world, but there was a sort of controversy. The FBI tells the story that Ross Ulbricht just like set up Tor wrong on his server, and that it leaked its IP address, which is very possible. I mean, Ross was not like an expert hacker or cybersecurity expert. You know, he did the best he could for somebody who was making it all up as he went along. But it did seem likely to me and many like other people examining the case that there was an actual vulnerability in the Tor anonymity network itself that was somehow exploited to identify this server, and that it wasn't just like Ross had made a screw up, you know. And that would be important because it would suggest that the FBI had some vulnerability in Tor at least way back in 2013. Then when his case like was going to trial and pretrial hearings, the defense basically said like, well, if we think that you used some secret vulnerability in Tor to do this, that you didn't, it wasn't just a mistake, like, and if so, then is that a Fourth Amendment violation? You basically hacked this server, Ross's Silk Road server, without a warrant.
Yep.
And you need to tell us how you did this. And the prosecution, very tellingly, I think, did not say, like, we didn't hack it, here's how we did it. They instead said, listen, even if we did hack it, here's why it's not a Fourth Amendment violation. And the reasons were, like, quite legalistic. Like, one was that Ross Ulbricht had never claimed it was his server, so how could it be a Fourth Amendment violation of his privacy if he won't say it's his server, which is like this terrible catch-22, you know? And then the other one was that it's located in a foreign country. It was in Iceland. It was in Iceland. Yeah. So you know, the FBI, the NSA, even whatever, can like hack a foreign server if it doesn't have an American involved without a warrant. And
didn't they say like the vulnerability was something with a CAPTCHA? Right.
The story initially was that Ross Ulbricht had set up the CAPTCHA on the Silk Road.
Right.
You know, this like, you know, the scrambled letters that like you used to log into the Silk Road, that leaked the IP address. But then when that was questioned, the prosecution essentially said, well, listen, we're not going to tell you how we did it, but we don't need to. The thing is, like, even if we did hack it, like, it's not a Fourth Amendment violation. So let's just move on. And that's what happened. In fact, the defense kind of seemed like they were trapped by this. They couldn't say like, okay, well, this is Ross Ulbricht's server and he has a privacy right to it, because they didn't want to admit that it was his server. So
yeah, I need to, like I said, I need to go look at that again. I should have been more ready for that,
well,
but it just didn't look like. I think the way you just described it, like catch-22, is the best way to describe how it got through, because the way that they went to defend it made no sense, and then they fell back on the, well, then admit it's yours.
Exactly. So, and you know, anyway, so I think that's how, I think that there's definitely like on it, whatever. I have my own theories about how the FBI found the Silk Road server, and then they had his laptop. They actually identified Ross. They got the name Ross Ulbricht for the first time from a very like silly kind of mistake he made.
That was Alfred, right? The IRS guy?
Yeah, there was an IRS agent, Gary Alford, who was just essentially Googling, and he had seen this post of someone like seeming to promote the Silk Road on a drug forum under the name Altoid. I think this is, if I can remember correctly.
That's right. Yes.
And then Altoid had also been a username that was posting to a coding forum saying, "Can anybody help me with web development on some other project that Ross Ulbricht was doing?" And he had listed his email address in that second post, rossulbricht@gmail.com. Tried to delete it, but it was like captured in somebody's response to the message. So that was the first time that law enforcement came upon his name, and ultimately that plus the server was how they got him.
How they got to him in San Francisco. So they bagged him and everything. But you were starting this explaining about the the genesis of your book, which is the Bitcoin traceability.
Right.
And I think if I remember correctly, this had to do with Carl Force and Sean Bridges, the DEA and Secret Service agents who were dirty in this case?
This is really where the story of my book begins. Like the Silk Road case is something that I covered I tell all of this in the book, but just almost like in passing to try to get to this.
Right.
So there's one IRS criminal investigator, Tigran Gambarian, was based in Oakland at the time. And his superiors were, I think, a bit annoyed that they had been left out of the Silk Road case. But then Tigran got a tip from a cryptocurrency exchange where you buy and sell, Bitcoins, whatever, for traditional money, that this mysterious guy, Karl Mark Force, was cashing out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoins from some unknown origin through this exchange. Couldn't tell the exchange where they came from. It seemed kind of fishy. Tigran immediately figured out Karl Mark Force is one of those Baltimore agents investigating the Silk Road. He was a DEA agent.
He was undercover. He was with Ross.
He had been undercover on the Silk Road, yes. And Tigran, the IRS agent in Oakland, starts digging in, and he's like, I think that Karl Mark Force was on the take essentially from the Silk Road. Karl Mark Force, also believing that Bitcoin was untraceable, was like doing the kind of typical corrupt cop thing of like just grabbing whatever money was available. And also even there was evidence that he had started to encrypt his conversations, his undercover conversations with the Dread Pirate Roberts, so that even law enforcement couldn't read them. Karl Mark Force was secretly communicating. So, this looks really suspicious, but Tigran is like, I just need to prove that he's getting paid, that Karl Mark Force's dirty Bitcoins are coming from the Silk Road. How am I going to do that?
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.